There are two passages I want to begin with that help to demarcate where we start and where we're going. The first I've already read a few weeks ago, but if you weren't here, it'll be fresh for you. 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 to 17, we find these words. Do not love the world or things in the world. The love of the Father is not in those who love the world. For all that is in the world, the desire of the flesh, the desire of the eyes, the pride and riches, comes not from the Father, but from the world. And the world and its desire are passing away. But those who do the will of God live forever. This is the journey, right? It's just one way of describing it. We start loving the world and we're on a journey to love God. Galatians says something similar. This is Galatians chapter 5, beginning in verse 16. Live by the Spirit, I say, and do not gratify the desires of the flesh. For what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit, and what the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. For these are opposed to each other to prevent you from doing what you want. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not subject to the law. Now the works of the flesh are obvious: fornication, impurity, licentiousness, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, anger, quarrels, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these. I'm warning you as I warned you before, those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, competing against one another, envying one another. This is the journey that we're on. We see it in the life of Samson. We see it in the story of Abraham. We see it in the story of Jacob. We see it in the story of Joseph. We see it in the story of David. We see it in the story of Solomon. We see it in the story of the apostles. Over and over and over again, it's the same story. It's your story too. We are born animals given to instinct. And we are on a road to become children of God. And I'm hoping that as we look intently at the story of Samson, that we won't just see his story, but we'll see the ways in which we are participating in his story. Samson will learn his lesson, but when it is too late to make any substantial difference to who he is. Perhaps we can learn his lesson sooner. So we're going to look at Samson and how he behaves when he's strong. Samson in his strength. That's point one for those who like to take notes. Point two will be Samson in inadequacy, when he's not strong enough to do something. And then finally, the third point will be Samson in vulnerability. So the first point comes from chapter 15, verses 9 through 17. Now really, this first point, Samson in his strength, the whole story's been that to this point, but we pick it up here in chapter 15 of Judges, beginning in verse 9. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, "We've come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock at Etam, and they said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What have you done to us?" He replied, "As they did to me, so I've done to them." They said to him, "We've come down to bind you so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." Samson answered them, "Swear to me that you yourselves will not attack me." They said to him, "No, we'll only bind you and give you into their hands. We won't kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. Then he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached down and took it, and with it he killed 1,000 men. And Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey I have slain 1,000 men." When he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and that place was called Ramat Lehi, which means the hill of the jawbone. Now, as readers, I hope you caught it in that passage too. We've known that Samson's strength was not coming from himself, right? Every time he does one of these magnificent feats, it says in the text that the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. So we've known as readers that this is coming from God each and every time. It's not a permanent endowment. He doesn't get it from his hair. He doesn't get it from his muscles. He doesn't get it from the fact he didn't drink wine. Every time this happens, the Spirit comes upon him. So he's being actively strengthened each of these times by the Lord. But you'd never know that listening to Samson speak. He never credits God with his achievements. Even later in chapter 16, verse 17, which we'll get to momentarily, when he's telling Delilah the true story of where his strength comes from, even then he doesn't say it comes from the Lord. He says it comes from my hair. He seems completely unaware of how active God is at every step of his life. He takes sole credit because he's strong enough to do that. And we too, when we're strong, we often assume that we've done what we've done in our own strength. I mean, we turn to God just like Samson will in a little bit when we can't handle the situation. But if I can handle it, who needs God? And Samson had no end to his strength, so there was really no need ever to turn to God for Samson. He was strong enough to handle it on his own. And God is aware of that problem in humanity from the very beginning. In fact, when he calls the Israelites to follow him into the land of promise, he's worried that when they get there and they settle in a land and it's rich and bountiful, that they will forget that they don't live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 10, we find these words, "When the Lord your God has brought you into the land that he swore to your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob to give you, a land with fine, large cities that you did not build, houses filled with all sorts of goods that you did not fill, hewn cisterns that you did not hew, vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant, and you've eaten your fill. Take care that you don't forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. The Lord your God you shall fear. Him you shall serve, and by his name alone you shall swear. Don't follow other gods, any of the gods of the peoples who are all around you, because the Lord your God who is present with you is a jealous God. The anger of the Lord your God would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you from the face of the earth." And so the question for us who finds ourselves in times of plenty is, what are you doing? What are you sowing towards in times of plenty? Are you sowing to the flesh the way Samson did, following the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh, being prideful in the way your life is going? Or are you sowing into the kingdom? During seasons of victory and strength and vigor, Samson forgot the Lord. It's a temptation for us too. But then Samson finds himself walking into a place in life in which he was no longer strong enough to handle the situation he was facing. All those muscles, all that spirit, all that power, all that charisma. And he finds himself helpless in a situation that's so trivial, it's almost laughable. Here we are in chapter 15, verse 18, Samson in his inadequacy. By then he was very thirsty, and he called on the Lord saying, because remember, he's in a wilderness area, there's no water. You've granted this great victory by the hand of your servant, and now? Am I now to die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So God split open the hollow place that's at Lehi, and water came from it. When he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore it was named En-Hakkore, which is at Lehi to this day. I just want to say this. This is Samson being Samson. Nothing ever changes for this guy. He named the place the spring of the one who calls. He named it after himself. Now, I wouldn't call this a model prayer. Please, nobody write a book called The Prayer of Samson and sell it, all right? But God did grant his request. But do you notice the tension in the story here? Between a man who just took on 1,000 Philistines with a piece of bone he found lying by the side of the road, and now he can't even get water in the wilderness? When a need was beyond Samson's ability to supply. At the very least, and I think this is to his credit, he knew to whom to go. But why would God grant such a self-centered request from such a sinful human being? God had chosen Samson to do a task that Samson was going to do. And again, God's answering of this prayer is less about Samson and more about what God wanted of Samson. And so he gives him water. But Samson, because during his time of health and strength and vigor sowed to the flesh, In his time of despair, there's no relationship with God. There's no conversation with God. God gives him the water, but he doesn't even talk to him. Well, notice how different that is when God interacts with Abraham, when he interacts with Elijah. So different. There's no relationship because Samson has not sought one. And so in his moment of need, he cries out to God. At least he knows that much, that he does need God when he can't do it himself. But in a place of no relationship, God doesn't relate with him at all. And Samson remains almost unchanged by the miracle. As protected as we make ourselves, we come up against the limits of our adequacy as well. And even though, like Samson, we try to make our lives as safe as possible, leaving our dependence on God as a last resort in case we can't handle it on our own, if we come into those circumstances unprepared, we will find ourselves so very alone. During seasons of victory and strength and vigor, Samson forgot the Lord. During seasons of weakness and inadequacy, he remembered the Lord sort of, but there was no relationship there. Our final point is Samson in his vulnerability. And I may not read every word of this, but this is chapter 16. So the story starts with Samson still sowing to his flesh. He hasn't learned anything about his vulnerability or God's miracle. He's still doing kind of what he wants to do. And he sees a prostitute that he likes, and what do you imagine he's going to do? The same thing he always does when he sees something he likes. He's going to take it. So he goes into the prostitute, and the Philistines want to kill him, and he realizes that's going to happen. So he goes and takes the gates of the city, picks them up, carries them up to the top of the hill, puts them down, and says, "Here I am." He's still very prideful, right? And then he goes into another city, and he finds another woman that he likes. And he decides to shack up with her, and her name is Delilah. He never marries her in the text. And she's likely an Israelite because of her name, though it's possible she's a Philistine. There's no real way to know. But she is a match for his wickedness. Chapter 16, verse 4. After this, he fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came to her and said, "Coax him and find out what makes his strength so great, and how we may overpower him, so that we may bind him in order to subdue him, and we'll give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me what makes your strength so great." And they go through this thing, and Samson, just like the last time he was hanging out with a woman he shouldn't have been with, and she tried to get a secret out of him that had consequence, he lies to her. Each time she tries to catch him and realizes that she's not finding out the secret of his strength. And then finally in verse 15, then she said to him, "How can you say I love you when your heart's not with me? You've mocked me 3 times now and have not told me what makes your strength so great." Finally, after she had nagged him with her words day after day and pestered him, he was tired to death. So he told her his whole secret and said to her, "A razor has never come upon my head, for I've been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, then my strength would leave me. I would become weak and be like anyone else. The secret is my hair," is what he's saying. When Delilah realized that he had told her his whole secret, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, "This time come up, for he's told the whole secret to me." Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in their hands. She let him fall asleep on her lap, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. He began to weaken. His strength left him. Then she said, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." When he awoke from his sleep, he thought, "I'll go out as at other times and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. So the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes. They brought him down to Gaza and bound him with bronze shackles, and he ground at the mill in the prison. But the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the lords of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to their god Dagon, and to rejoice, for they said, "Our God has given Samson our enemy into our hand." When the people saw him, they praised their God, for they said, "Our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who's killed many of us." And when their hearts were merry, they said, "Call Samson, let him entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. They made him stand between the pillars. And Samson said to the attendant who held him by the hand, "Let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, so that I may lean against them." Now the house was full of men and women. All the lords of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson performed. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, "Lord God, remember me, and strengthen me only this once, O God, so that with this one act of revenge I may pay back the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Then Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." He strained with all his might, and the house fell on the lords and all the people who were in it. So those he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of his father Manoah. He had judged Israel 20 years. The eyes that Samson had so relied on, that he had followed, that he had trusted, were taken from him. The flesh that he had so indulged now was put to work like an animal, treading out grain. And even here at the end of himself, he has not really grown. He does not want to kill the Philistines because God has commanded him to deliver the Israelites. He wants to kill them for vengeance. He's still Samson. He's sown to the flesh, and he is fleshly to the end of himself. But finally, Samson does learn something. He learns at the end, finally, when it's too late to change very much about him or his circumstances, that his strength was not in his hair. That his success in life wasn't because of his hard work, or because of his keen intellect, or because of his dynamic personality, or because he just put in more effort than anybody else, and that's why I'm at the top of my career. He finds out that none of that is true. That his strength has always come from the Lord. And even though he has barely stubble on his head, he thought it was in his hair, but it wasn't, he realizes that he can cry out to God, and that without any hair or any vow, God can make him strong again. And so he finally prays to ask to fulfill the calling God placed on him before he was born. I don't imagine this is the way God would have liked him to end his life. We see better stories of conquerors, David and others. But it's all that was left to Samson because of the way he used his strength. Life will strip away our strengths too. That vigor, that strength, that emotional fortitude, all those things that we have, it slowly ekes away. Life is designed, it would seem, to do that. To erode the self-sufficiency that we so rely on. There's no way to hold on to it. And there was no way for Samson, despite his strength and everything else. His own fleshly inadequacies opened him to the very things that would take away all the things he relied on. Now there's hope in the story of Samson because it would seem that God never gave up the calling that he placed on Samson's life. Even here at the end, after a life of evil, he does fulfill what God has asked him to do. But what would Samson's life have been like if he had learned this lesson younger? Might he have had the experience of David? Might he have had the experience of Daniel? Might he have had the experience of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who when they went into the fire walked out unscathed? That couldn't be for Samson because of the way he had sowed. During seasons of victory and strength and vigor, Samson forgot the Lord, and we do too. During seasons of inadequacy, we turn to God, but so many times we do not change. And during the final season of vulnerability, when Samson began to reap what he had sown, when all that he had relied on his whole life had been stripped away from him, he turned to God to redeem his legacy and his reputation, and God does that. But he cannot survive to see it. Our desire in this life cannot be primarily to be loved. It cannot be primarily to be special. It cannot be primarily to be important. You've heard the story of Samson. Those were what he went after. Love, power, importance, significance. Our heart's desire, church, must be faithfulness. Not greatness, faithfulness. What kind of a legacy are you leaving? When your children or your grandchildren or your friends and your neighbors look back on the story of your life, will you have called people to you or to God? This is the story of Samson, and it's our story too. Tales are told of Samson's greatness to this day, but there's nothing in the life of Samson that would lead someone to God unless they learn from his mistakes. For those of us who are living into the story of Samson, might we learn before it's too late. what it is to be dependent on God.